Hey everybody, good to see you again. Class, we have reached the end of our units of content. So this is the final video of content, and it is topic 7 of unit 6. And today we're going to be exploring the effects of migration. Let me just say on a personal note, it's been fun doing these videos, but not as fun as it would be having y'all actually in class. But I hope you're taking good notes, and I hope you are ready for, as we're going to transition into something a little bit different after this video is released, and then over the coming days into prepping for the AP exam and looking at DBQs. So let's do this, right? We're going to look at 6.7. Today it's the effects. Let me move this way. There we go. The effects of migration. As we looked at in the previous video, migration led to demographic changes. Most migrants were male, which leads to changes in the home cultures. New and old cultures are mixed, and you have more racial and ethnic prejudice. How and why did patterns of migration affect society between 1750 and 1900? That is our last essential question that we're going to be tackling today. So let's get right to it and go to the first slide. Well, migrant experiences and the effect their migration had on their home culture, it varies by location. So I'm going to try to unpack this as much as I can. Most migration causes shifting demographics and gender roles at home. So let's break this down to the roles of women and remittances, okay? As for the role of women, the experience varied by home country, as I said. In some places, males didn't leave until a male relative could take over their family. The role of women remains unchanged, but some women will gain roles outside of the home and a traditional role when men do leave. Some women followed their husbands, and they will usually play a bigger role in family decisions when that happened. If husbands returned, women often continue to play a larger role outside of the home. We have some continuities and we have some changes, because that's what happens to industrialization when things like that occur. Oftentimes you would see remittances, and that is defined as money sent home from a migrant to their family. If the remittance was big enough, women could work less and spend more time with the family. The women are the ones that have the control in how the remittances are spent for the most part. And the remittances often led to young children staying in school a lot longer. So see what this is going to lead to. It's not just a change in home societies, as it says right here, but it's also a change in and a new creation. We're birthing a new education system out of this, and a lot of things kind of take root here. So moving along, I'm going to stop right here. If you'd like to pause this to take some notes in your packet. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. Immigrants. Now, this is the effects of migration on receiving societies, okay? Immigrants wanted a new economic start, but they wanted to continue practicing their culture. And many of them will form something called ethnic enclaves, which are clusters of people from the same foreign country. And they will retain the language, food, and customs from home while absorbing some new parts of culture. For example, Chinese enclaves. And here's a picture of Chinatowns. You see these in some of our bigger cities, especially out west. San Francisco has a large Chinatown. Los Angeles, places like that have just an ethnic part of town. Chicago has a whole bunch of them, especially on the north side of Chicago. There's a lot of different ethnic enclaves that we see happening there. But we're still talking about 1750 to 1900. So Southeast Asia is thriving at this point. It managed their opium farms and its distribution to Great Britain once they finally settled their differences about that. They will hold posts with the colonial government. They will become business owners and traders, and China is now allowed to control trade in the region, despite the open door policy. I think that's pretty important. The Americas, they came to the U.S. for gold, and they stayed to work on the railroads. 225,000 Chinese laborers were coerced. Now, I'm using the word coercion. Again, it's coercive labor system, right? We could say slavery, but remember, that's only a form of coercive labor system. But this has a little bit deeper meaning to it. Into an 8-year contract to work in Cuba and Peru on sugar plantations, but they're also going to be used to build railroads. the railroad throughout the Andean region, and that's the Andes Mountains that run down the west coast of Latin America, South America. And they leave their cultural stamp just like you see Chinese fusion food in Peru. You still see that today. And sometimes they even married locals, which is going to bring a mixture of the races, so to speak, making that society a little bit more diverse. Chinese will also be used to build railroads here in the United States. And of course, the United States treats them far worse than they were treated in South America. Argentina has Italians, and Argentina was immigrated to second most globally behind the United States. They call the U.S. a nation of immigrants, so was Argentina, and in many cases it was a bigger one. As a matter of fact, they encouraged immigration, and they provided immigrants basic civil rights. The culture and language is influenced. Italians made up 1/2 of the immigrants in Argentina, if you can believe that. 55% of today's Argentinian population is descended from Italian immigrants. So that's a pretty big factor. Why? Well, why is Argentina so, everybody wanted to go there? Well, they had a low population, fertile land, a lot of job opportunities, and a low cost of living. Immigrants raised their standard of living throughout all of this. So I'll stop right here so you can pause, but I want to show you some of the new littles that spring out of this. And here is, and I know this is probably tough to read. Let me cut off one of the lights to see maybe we can zoom in on this a little bit clearer. Notice how these are littles. And what I mean by littles is that these are areas of town that are created. For example, and I know it's very difficult to tell, but you see here, this one says China, everything in red. So these are like Chinatowns, areas of China. Little Italy, for instance, here in the pink. All right, you ever hear parts of town called, oh, that's Little Pakistan, Little Syria, Little Italy. All of that was born out of this particular time period with these new littles. Let me cut the lights back on so I can clear that up a little bit more. But this is kind of, I just thought that was an interesting thing to put up there, showing you how all of that has happened. So let's look at Africa, the effects of migration on receiving societies. The British ended slavery in 1833. We've talked about this before in a previous video, but they replaced it with a different kind of slavery, indentured servitude, and Indians were among the first indentured servants. Many Indians went to the islands off the coast of Africa, in what is today Mauritania, or South Africa, Natal as they called it, as indentured servants to work on sugar plantations and build railroads. You have a mixing of the religions here. Hindus and Muslims immigrated. And yes, the Hindus brought the caste system with them. Now, eventually they're going to abandon these castes, but they keep other religious traditions. A lot of prejudice and injustice is suffered by them. Mohandas Gandhi, yeah, that's him as a young man. He was an Indian who came to Africa to practice law in 1893. He experienced racial discrimination, and he would become probably one of the earliest civil rights activists in the world. He made the Natal Indian Congress to show world discrimination that Indians face in South Africa. Now, in 1914, which is the year that World War I breaks out in Europe, he goes back to India to work for Indian independence from Great Britain. I think the timing here was a little off because a major world war was about to get everybody's attention. In Southeast Asia, the biggest source of labor for the British colonies were Indians. And they went as indentured servants. They were replaced by something called the Kanani system, where entire families were recruited to work on tea, coffee, and rubber plantations. Now, their lives are less restricted here, and they had families with them. But 6 million Indians went to Southeast Asia before the end of this Kanani system, and they kept close ties with India. This is not the only place India dispersed. They also dispersed into the Caribbean. The largest ethnic group in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, which are two little bitty islands in the Caribbean, worked on plantations. And Indians were the biggest part of the population everywhere in the Caribbean. They blended with the native culture that was already there, and the arrival of Indians is something that is celebrated in those places to this day. So in a way, this probably wasn't too bad of a thing for migration for folks. So I think this is interesting to talk about in a world today that seems to be so anti-immigrant. We see in history how it has actually worked before. But now let's get to the bad stuff. Prejudice and regulation of immigration. Immigrants work for lower wages than native workers. There's resentment. There's institutionalized discrimination. Let's look at the United States, for example. Resistant to low-cost migrant labor. Now check out some of these laws here. The California Constitution of 1879. This is a state constitution prohibiting state, county, and local jobs from hiring Chinese. Like they weren't even allowed to hire Chinese people. I told you earlier just how bad this is going to get as far as the U.S.'s standpoint. Non-white people could not be citizens under this Constitution, regardless of what the American Constitution said. And the American Constitution of 1879 didn't exactly specify. Now, the 14th Amendment, if you'll look that up, should have been enough of an explanation. But for California, they found loopholes here. And they encouraged Chinese removal and segregation from towns. This inevitably is now going to lead to a national law, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was signed into law by President Chester Arthur, bans Chinese immigration for 10 years. It puts a 10-year moratorium on Chinese immigration. And it was extended and made permanent in 1902. During World War II, this is going to be repealed because China is going to be on our side in World War II. The Mexican president, Porfirio Diaz, encouraged Chinese immigration to Mexico. So if the U.S. is trying to ban it, Mexico is trying to encourage it. And let's take a look. You can tell here in Australia, also known as White Australia, because it was a British colony, a penal colony at first, Chinese immigration to Australia switched from indentured servants to settlers after the gold rush. 50,000 Chinese, more or less, came to Australia during that time. In 1855, Australia passes the Chinese Immigration Act. Notice the difference between Chinese Immigration Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in the United States. It limited the number of Chinese that could get off a boat. So they found a way around that. They started to land in South Australia instead. In 1860, though, it turned ugly. That's the problem with xenophobia. It can turn ugly, no matter what the law says. White miners attacked Chinese migrant quarters, and they killed several of them. That's an event that largely gets ignored in history. And so in 1861, they're going to pass the Chinese Immigration Regulation and Restriction Act in 1861. That's Australia we're still talking about. And it restricts how many Chinese could enter the colony. Then you have the Influx of Chinese Restriction Act, where any Chinese coming into that country would now have to pay a tax. Well, Chinese immigrants made huge economic contributions to Australia, but that didn't change the fact that they weren't discriminated against because they were. So the White Australia policy was intended to limit all non-British immigration. And that is going to actually remain in Australia until the 1970s. Because remember, Australia is still part of the British Commonwealth at that time. So don't forget that. A lot of this stuff carries well into modern times today, unfortunately. But you can tell, the U.S. and Australia, now I don't want to ask you to rank who treated the Chinese the worst because, well, honestly, that's up for grabs. I think either one was pretty unacceptable. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to conclude our final topic of content for AP World History, and this is the end. So you now have content for Units 1, 2, 3, and 4, which went back when we met in person, and you also now have content for Units 5 and 6 for what we have done here through distance learning. So the next video that I show, our next meeting will be on Zoom, and we're going to walk through DBQ workshops so that y'all can score a 5 on the AP exam, and boy, what an opportunity you all have. So this has been fun. It's not the same, and I wish you all the best, and take good care of yourself. Have a great day.